So the webinar today that we're going to be talking about is managing weeds, cover crops, managing weeds. We have 4 guest speakers with us today, and we're glad to have Francois Tardif from the University of Guelph, Mike Cowbrough, weed specialist with OMAFRA, and also Charlene and Mark that are farmers from Ontario that will be sharing their stories and what's happening on their farms and how they're utilizing cover crops. If you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat area. Or at the end of the sessions after the presentations, if you'd like to actually speak to the group, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. But during the presentations, please have yourself muted. You can always be on camera if you'd like, depending on your internet connection. But at this time, I'd like to ask Francois Tardif to do a quick presentation, and we'll have questions afterwards. And this is really about asking questions of the specialists, and really look forward to the dialogue that we'll have after the quick presentations today.
All right, thanks, Marty. So when we organized this webinar, I thought we'd start first and cover the basics, right? How cover crops can help control weeds. So we won't get into what other things cover crops are doing. We're assuming that this can be covered elsewhere. And then after Mike and Charlene and Mark will go into more details on how you can apply these principles and how it works. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So I thought, when we look at cover crops and their effect on weeds, basically we're looking at plant-plant interaction. It's interesting to look at the life cycle of, in that case, an annual weed, lamb squatters. So we like to start it from the seed banks, all those seeds in the soil, and then you get germination and emergence, which lead to seedlings, then vegetative growth. And then if we're not able to control these plants, they will flower, set seed, and get seed bank return. So with herbicides and other methods, we can target different part of the life cycle. With cover crops in general, we're looking at germination and emergence as being the main target. So we're really trying to prevent that, either germination or if they emerge, trying to stun their growth so they don't take over. In some cases, cover crops will also impact seed bank return by helping getting rid of weeds at that stage. And I'll get to that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So next. So basically, when we look at cover crops and weeds, we're looking at plant-plant interaction. All different plant species look at each other. So this is a slide that's adapted from my class in weed science. I just basically changed cover crop, for crop, and then the weeds are out there. So it's the same thing that happened. So the round green circle are basically the plants, and then the resources, that's what plants take from the environment, that's the brown circle. And in the case of indirect interaction, basically we're looking at the way different species will draw from these resources. A direct interaction is when 2 plant species will talk to each other or interact directly with each other. And it goes both ways. A cover crop will interact with the weed, and the weed will interact with the cover crop. So next slide shows the outcome of it. So basically what we want to happen is that the cover crop takes over by being able to exploit more resources from the environment, hence the larger blue arrow and the bigger green circle, and the weeds will stay the same or shrivel down. So we're trying to impact the way the weeds will be able to get these resources. In the direct interaction, basically it's the cover crop being able to negatively impact the growth of the weed without having an impact on the way they or without getting rid of the resources. Next slide explains that in other terms, which may be more familiar. So if we go to next. So the difference, indirect, that's competition for resources. So we're familiar with competition. It's light, water, nutrients that are in the soil, water in the soil, light, obviously. And then direct interaction, that's what we call allelopathy. That's production of some toxic compounds. The third one I put there is environment modification. It's something that has been less documented, but we know cover crops can also impact other factors like temperature, soil temperature, which will impact weed recruitment. And in some cases, some studies have shown that insect predation can be impacted as well. You can have more insects in the cover crops that will affect weeds. So next slide. So basically the key there from the, the literature, scientific literature is that, you want a quick establishment of a dense cover crop. The more cover crop, the quicker it can get, the better it's going to be. That is variable. It will change depending on the conditions. So that's for the dense cover crop. Next slide shows that in a little bit more detail. So we got 8 species there of cover crops studied in Michigan. Basically, the bottom line is that, all the species reduce the weed biomass 70 to 76% compared to no cover crops, so they're able to do their job. They will vary, and they will vary depending on the biomass you put out there, but that explains only 8 to 43% of the effect. So there's other factors that will occur there. And one, could be linked to allelopathy. Here's winter rye, your favorite cover crop, Jake. So it's out there. So there's more than the biomass that accumulates there. So it's the other factor. Next slide covers that, I think. Well, allelopathy, that's like magic, right? Although, as Uncle Vernon would say, there's no such thing as magic. So allelopathy is not magic, it's science. Next. Allelopathy, that's complicated. Basically, you have compounds in rye that are called BX compounds. So the BX concentration will increase over time. And in general, 2 months after planting, you'll have the maximum concentration in the tissue, and then it declines afterward. So as the rye is maturing, the concentration of BX reduces. Rye biomass, that's the other side, will tend to increase more, especially under our condition. Fall rye, accumulate biomass in the spring. So it will vary. In the end, you may get the same amount, but it will vary a lot according to cultivars, conditions, soil type, temperature, etc. So it's a little bit like buying a herbicide, and the concentration of the active is not written on it. You have to guess, and that's why people have different results with rye and other cover crops as well when you look at allelopathy. And I think the next slide is the fact that it's multifactorial. So nitrogen fertilization can impact the amount of BX in rye. Stress may increase allelopathy but reduce growth. And then you get varieties with high biomass, but they're less phytotoxic to the weed. So it's kind of complicated. So to cover very briefly what I said, I think the next slide will be my take home. It depends. The effect of weeds, of cover crops on weeds, depends on very many factors. The key thing is to establish quickly and have good accumulation, biomass accumulation. And then if you have allelopathy, it's a bonus. On this, I'll give the floor to Mike.
Yeah, perfect, Francois. Thanks very much. Mike Cowbrough with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. So if we look in Ontario, the seeding of cover crops after soybean, dry bean, or cereal harvest provide a really great opportunity to reduce late season weed germination and seed production that ultimately is returned to the soil. And current Ontario statistics show about 1.5 million acres of soybeans and dry beans that aren't seeded to winter wheat. Next. And so certainly a portion of those acres will be seeded to cover crops. A recent survey by OMAFRA indicates that 30% of farmers regularly plant cover crops. But if we err on the side of being pessimistic, that still means that there are about 2 million acres that are left uncovered after soybean, dry bean, and cereal harvests collectively. So this can significantly influence weed germination and weed seed return to the soil. Those acres can be targeted with simple and cost-effective cereal-based cover crops as a nice gateway cover crop to gain experience and confidence so that you can customize things for your own operation. Next. And so by planting a cover crop after harvest, you're creating an environment that is not hospitable for a weed seed lying near the surface of the soil, hoping to germinate. The environment on the left side of your screen is ideal if you're a weed seed. There's plenty of sunlight and warmth and moisture for germination and living a good life. On the other side, though, the environment on the right, is underneath a cereal crop cover canopy. It's less than ideal. Next. And so if we look at field situations, in this particular field on the screen, the farmer was already going to spread potash after wheat harvest. and then run a tillage implement through to incorporate the fertilizer into the soil. But the decision was made to try blending 50 pounds of oats with the potash, broadcast it on, and then incorporate it into the ground. That cost an additional $16 an acre for the oats. Next slide. Now, the immediate value of that $16 per acre was that when compared to wheat fields left bare around the region, there were fewer weeds. They had not started to flower. And so ultimately that was fewer weed seeds returned to the soil. Next. So if we compare to fields that were left in the area to be fallow, they were clearly noticeably more weedy. Next. And there were more species, some of which were glyphosate resistant, like the Canada fleabane highlighted below. They were all at higher densities than where the cover crop existed, and they were all larger and well on their way to setting seed to be returned to the soil. So if we look at that $16 per acre investment in oats, you've now incorporated a new mode of action into your weed management plan that has other benefits aside from reduced weed seed return. Next. Now, cereal cover crops also release allelopathic chemicals that Francois talked about, cereal rye being the most notorious. They all do it, but cereal rye is most effective at it. Here's a picture taken from Ted Van Hey's research project, where 50 pounds per acre of cereal rye was planted in late October to mid-November. And it consistently, over the duration of this project, reduced the population of glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane the following spring. And you can see by the sparse canopy in this photo that allelopathy is likely the greatest contributor to weed control, not direct competition. As a sparse canopy like this is also not very intimidating if you wanted to kill it off and plant into it the next spring. Again, cereal rye seems to be a nice gateway cover crop to gain experience into your cropping system. Next slide. Another field shot I like from Ted's trials shows evidence of that allelopathy from the roots of cereal rye. And notice the absence of weeds in that narrow band beside the last row of cereal rye. In Ted's trials, we also observed reductions in populations of other weeds like lamb's quarters and pigweed species, which year in and year out are two of the most prominent and competitive groups of weed species that affect crop yield. Next. And even as Francois alluded to, there can be tremendous variability in the allelopathy produced by rye. Sometimes it's not enough to stop the fleabane from germinating and emerging, but it sometimes can be potent enough to prevent the weeds from getting too big. So in this case, we observed significantly smaller fleabane within the cereal rye cover crop, even if they germinated and emerged. Next. When compared to plants not exposed to cereal rye, they were often 5 times higher. So in this case, instead of being 10 centimeters tall, it was 50 centimeters tall. Next. And all that to mean that the bottom line is, it's not rocket science. Smaller plants are much easier to kill with the herbicide program. And so even if the cereal rye cover crop doesn't kill the Canada fleabane, it keeps it smaller, keeps it more likely to be successfully controlled with a herbicide program. Next. So in practice, farmers have shared their experiences of Canada fleabane being much easier to manage when cereal rye somehow is incorporated into the rotation, either as a crop or as a cover crop. And in this example on your screen, Canada fleabane was much less abundant and much more easily controlled when the corn was coming out of cereal rye compared to the part of the field that was coming out of continuous corn on the right-hand side. And next and last, so if you're a cover crop curious person, maybe you haven't, you're just dipping your toe in, I think keeping it simple and starting with cereal cover crops like oats or rye are cost effective and they're an easy way to manage, but provide significant benefits as another mode of action in your weed management plan. And so with that, I'm very curious to learn from Charlene and Mark about their experiences.
Thanks, Mike and Francois. Actually, before we start with Charlene, we just have a quick poll we'd like to ask everybody. If you could just bear with us for a minute and answer the poll, and then Charlene will take it over from there. So we're looking for your affiliation and just wondering how you're affiliated. And thanks for answering the poll. Do we have a result from that, or are we going to do that later? Oh, there we go. Excellent. Appreciate all the specialists that are on the call here today, having farmers here and advisors as well. It's great that you've joined us. And we're also grateful for Cribbit Seeds for sponsorship today. With that, we really want to hear from the specialists that are working with us in the field, and Charlene and Mark will give us how they've been working with cover crops in the field. Go ahead, Charlene.
Sorry, muted. So I'm Charlene Whattam. I farm in Douglas, Ontario, which is about an hour northwest of Ottawa, just off of Highway 17. We've got 240 acres that we cash crop here, and we have some pasture ground and scrubby ground that used to be a 300 head feedlot once upon a time, but now mostly provides some browse for our goat herd. Next, please. So my personal experience, I'm fairly new to cover cropping, trying to incorporate that into my farm and feel like, yes, having living roots and living plants that I want to be there the majority of the year is definitely going to be helpful for my farm. So in the spring of 2019, we had a fairly challenging spring here, and I have a couple of smaller fields that, yes, need tile very badly, but it's really hard to get the person who does the tiling to come for some very small fields at the time of year when they're available to come. So as a consequence, in 2019, the only thing that was planted in my field was apparently this cute little fawn deer. I was walking the field in June and found that little guy, but the field was way too squishy to plant. So after the crop insurance deadline passed, I was just trying to figure out what to do. Happened to have some seed in a warehouse that was subpar as far as germination went, and couldn't be sold to the public. So I thought, well, let's use it up, get it out of the warehouse. You always feel bad throwing something away, especially, you know, when there's seed treatments and stuff. So it's nice if you can use it. So it was about a 50-50 barley soybean mix, and you sure wouldn't have known it had a germination issue when it started to grow. Next. So I had a whole lot of stuff growing in my field, and I don't have animals that really can use a green forage crop like that. It doesn't really suit the goats. So I have a neighbor down the road who has a dairy farm, and I called him up and I negotiated with him and said, if you can kind of cover my spraying and my planting, because I have to have a custom person come in and do my planting, you can come and take this feed away. And he thought that that would work quite well for him. Next. So he started harvesting just after the local fair that we have here, September 9th, and he continued to haul it away day by day on those wagons and feed it green to his herd right through Thanksgiving. And it was just an incredible amount of stuff that grew. Started at about head and boot stage on the barley, and the soybeans were flowering. And then by the end, the heads were definitely emerged, getting almost to that milk stage of barley. And I thought the awns might be a problem, but he said it worked wonderfully well. They just gobbled it up and it was gone. Left the field really nice and clean. Next. So as far as weed control goes, those little wet fields, they were right next to what would have been manure storage when there was a 300 head feedlot on my farm. So there's a lot of weed species and a lot of nutrition there. Didn't add any additional fertilizer when I did the planting there because there were lots of nutrients available in the soil. So it was planted in July. I burned it down before I planted just to make it nice and clean and simple. Burned it down in October and just a light dose of Roundup and kept it really nice and clean right through the next year. There's lots of weed species you can see on my farm, but it kept things very manageable. Next. I think that might be it. Is that it? Yes, that's it. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right, I guess it's my turn. So I'm Mark Burnham. I farm with my family. We're called Burnham Farms Limited. We're just located outside of Cobourg, which is in Northumberland County, just off the lake of, off the shore of Lake Ontario. So yeah, if you go to the next slide, I just want to go over like why we started into cover crops, where we're at, and kind of some of the lessons and tricks and stuff that we learned along the way, and some things that are starting to arise this season that we've been noticing. So next. All right, so Dad and I have, or Dad's been no-tilling for I don't know, 35 years, give or take. And about 20 years ago, we started noticing that even though we were no-tilling, we were still getting a lot of erosion in the spring. A lot of the snow melt and spring rains would still erode down our hills. This picture here just kind of shows some of the terrain that we do farm. So we decided to attend the National No-Till Conference down in the States about 15 years ago. And back then they were also sort of just starting to push hard for farmers to grow cover crops. So we came back from that very excited to start dabbling in that. And we kind of just started off after we'd put in oats and radishes, and we used a little bit of annual ryegrass, and we also tried to use annual ryegrass interseeded into corn. Next. So from that, we kind of grew and got comfortable with cover crops, and I'm a big machine guy and got into planting green and didn't see any issues why we couldn't do that. So this picture here is just a version of our planting system in 2018 of us planting into a thick cereal rye and volunteer wheat mainly at this point, cover crop. And yeah, we didn't have any real issues doing that. Next. Again, same year, we were no-tilling some edible beans and planted green. They work great. Something we did notice when we started planting green is, yeah, we do have a lot better control of Canada fleabane, which is, we do have resistance in our county, as most do in Ontario now. So yeah, planting green, it definitely reduced the stress of Canada fleabane in our edible beans, as it's a challenging weed to control. So moving on from 2018, we can go to the next slide. And so where we're at now is we've moved on from just kind of trying to reduce our erosion to cycling nutrients, adding soil organic matter, sequester or create nitrogen, or however you want to say that. Use the cover crops to also alleviate compaction. And we've got a lot of untiled fields that we try and use the cover crops to try and dry them out a bit in the spring. And there's also some other soil health benefits from that. And then I've got a list of our kind of our 12-way cover crop mix that we used last year on pretty well all 400 plus acres of our wheat. So something else that we've moved towards is using our new drill to drill our cover crops in. So what this is allowing us to do is it's a 3-bin cart, so we're allowed to variable rate our P and K in bands on the drill on one gang, and then we seed our cover crops with the other gang. So last year was the first year we tried this. So our cover crops are going in on 15-inch centers, and then our fertilizer is going in between the cover crops, and we're planting on a slight angle, so because it doesn't quite match up with our corn planter anymore. Next. So this picture is from this spring. It's the same field from my opening slide. It's just, yeah, a field that I was switching from one seed mix to the other. Dad was kind of trying to push me to stop using cereal rye in some of our cover crop mixes. So I came into this field with a half a bin of non-rye mix. I planted it, and then we had some rye in the next mix, and so we've got some very interesting stripes through this field where there is, it's basically 3-foot tall rye at this point. And something that I noticed when I was planting this field is that even though we have a good, an overly thick stand of volunteer wheat, in the rye there is significantly less weed pressure, and that's not just Canada fleabane, that's also like lamb's quarters and pigweed and other weeds. Next slide. So again, same field, slightly different spot. This was me side dressing last week. So yeah, in the no rye mix, the corn does visibly look better. It was probably about 1 leaf ahead of the rye mix portion of the field, and the stand was probably a little bit more consistent in the no rye mix. It's one of the reasons Dad's trying to get away from rye, which it's still arguable. I still argue with him some days about it. We'll talk about that in a couple slides here. So yeah, at this point in side dressing, there is some weed pressure, although at this point I don't think it's going to affect yield. But in the rye, there was again significantly less weed pressure than the no rye mix. Next slide. All right, so this is another field that I planted this spring. This is kind of more what Dad wants me to do. So this was our 12-way mix that I listed earlier, but without the rye, in a spot where the volunteer wheat was a lot more manageable. Maybe because the oats grew so quickly, it kind of smothered out or outcompeted the wheat. But this is kind of an ideal thing for us, and maybe something that we're looking forward or looking to go to in the future, is just a cover crop like this. It was beautiful to plant into, super mellow, and absolutely no issues with cover crops. There are some legumes, some clovers, and the odd pea and vetch that did survive, but it's so thin that you hardly notice it's in there. Next. So in that same field, we also have an on-farm plot on our farm, and so what we're checking on our on-farm plot is they're doing some soil health tests. So we're doing cover crops versus no cover crops, and then with and without the addition of manure. My source is horse manure. My sister's got a horse barn, so that was easy for me to source. So in this picture, I have a strip where there was no cover crop planted, and the volunteer wheat just exploded this spring. It wasn't nearly this thick in the fall, which turned out to be not a great thing. With this dry spring that we had, the wheat just really sucked the moisture out of it, which was a bit of an issue. Next slide. So this is side dressing in the same field, in a spot where, there's right on the edge of a thick wheat patch, and you can really see the stunting and the poor stand in the corn. Who knows if this is going to be showing up in the yield? Like maybe the wheat will save enough moisture later on in the season that it'll rebound enough and catch up to the rest of the corn. I'm not sure, but that side dressing it sure didn't look good. So next slide. Something else that we've more dabbled in than tried too hard to, is tried to interseed cover crops into standing corn. We started back probably 10 to 12 years ago trying to put annual ryegrass mostly into standing corn. That was back when we were on 30-inch corn. We're now on 20-inch corn and 20-inch beans, so it's a little bit different. But we were having a bit of issue with annual ryegrass becoming a weed for us, so we moved away from that. So with 20-inch corn and with some results that I'm going to share in a couple slides with our edible beans and cover crops, I'm looking at establishing cover crops in standing corn again. So this plot here was me hand spinning on some cereal rye and standing corn, and in this trial I had straight 20-inch rows versus skipping every third row of corn. So I've got a 40-inch row of corn, then a 20-inch row, 40-inch, 20-inch, and you can kind of see a little bit in this picture. There's a thin spot where the cereal rye didn't catch. That was in the 20-inch corn, and the thicker spots in the 40-20. So, and the neat thing about that trial with the corn is I didn't see any yield loss at the 40-20 corn. So that was good. So we'll see how well the beans do in there this year. We're planning on weighing that off. So hopefully I'll have some results come this fall. Next slide. So some other wins that we had with cover crops is, yeah, we've greatly reduced the number of washouts that we've had on our farm. And I think that's an easy way to pay for your cover crops, is just reducing your spring tillage fixing by going at like your $100+ an hour to go out and fix a washout in your field. And it doesn't take like 2 hours and you've got half a field paid for in cover crops kind of deal. The other benefits are the soil becomes more mellow and easier to plant, which means less compaction, but also less fuel usage when you go to plant it. It's just easier to pull the planter through it. And yeah, I believe our yields are equal, if not better. Profits are hard to measure at this point. Soil organic matter, it's a slow process. But I think we're winning on all those fronts. So yeah, next slide. This is the edible beans. We grow Zukis, and in this field, it was a field that was wheat the previous year. We put cover crops in expecting to put it into corn. So it had, I think that year was like a 10-way mix of cover crops, and probably about 25 pounds of oats, 25 pounds of rye, and basically everything else in that mix that I had. And we ended up planting green Azukis into it, and we had phenomenal yields in every field that we planted green into. We were getting phenomenal yields. The little yield monitor picture in the corner there, it's a little blurry, but it's a snapshot showing 50 bushels an acre in that field, which is just spectacular for us. Next. So there are some failures to go along with the wins. So planting green is, people are scared of it and think you have to plant green into 6-foot tall rye and you have to roller crimp it. What we've found is less is more. If you have a nice thin stand come spring, it does just as much for the following crop than a thick stand does. And it really makes the sorry, I lost my train of thought. it really isn't, when it's thin, it really isn't challenging to close the seed slot, which is the biggest issue in planting green. The one issue with planting green is it can be challenging in a wet spring. It can slow soil drying down a little bit. So it all depends on how thick your stand is. If it's super thick and you get a chance to burn off your cover crops early, that's kind of our suggestion. But if you don't get that early chance, if it's super thick, then you're just gonna have to be patient and hope for the best. Dry springs like this year, it's kind of the opposite. The cover crops suck too much moisture out, and you end up planting into a super dry seed bed. So again, yeah, burning off early if it's really thick, or if it's a really light soil, is maybe a route to consider. The field in my cover slide was kind of a sandy loam farm that got really advanced, and when planting it, I was kind of nervous that it was too dry, but the corn came up fine in it. Looking back, I may have sprayed it off early. And yeah, I kind of mentioned the other things there. So next slide. So a new issue that we've been discovering this year is with Canada fleabane being resistant and hard to control, and with our cover crop mixes after wheat. I noticed this in the fall of 20, that a lot of the fleabane was getting 6 to 12 to 16 inches tall in the fall, which concerned me. And I'm like, well, hopefully it's going to winter kill. Who knows what's going to happen? And so in the spring, I kind of kept an eye on it, and sure enough, the fleabane came back in the spring, and I'm like, oh boy, this might be challenging to control in our planting green scenario. And certainly enough, that's what we're seeing is our spring burn down in corn is Roundup and Acuron. It seems to burn the plant off, but it definitely rebounds, and if people have experience with that, it tends to rebound and branch out and be kind of pissed off. The other thing that we're having issue controlling is thistle, mostly sow thistle. And I'm thinking it's the same kind of issue, as we're letting it grow too long in the fall, and it's just too large to control in the spring. So something we're considering and going to try this year is change your cover crops slightly, and we do a fall burn down, either a complete kill with Roundup or Roundup Aragon or something like that in the fall to get the fleabane, or go in with maybe something like Infinity or Lawn Trail to get the fleabane and the thistle, and maybe leave a cereal to overwinter. So anyways, that's the end of my slides, and looking forward to some questions.
Thanks, Mark and Charlene. Those are great presentations on what you're doing with cover crops and how they're working on your farm. I think for most people, that's what they really want to understand, is how can they incorporate it, how can they work it. So you've got some practical information there. We did have a couple of questions come in, and before I open it wide open, for anybody who wants to ask any questions, you can put them in the chat, and we can ask that of the panelists. We can also, if you raise your hand, if you want to actually speak, if you'd rather speak than type, that's fine too. So we'll try to keep an eye on where the hands are being raised, but we'll start, Mark. A couple of questions came in for yourself. One of them was regarding when you're seeding your cover crops, and a lot of times cover crops, if you're putting a mixture in, it's different size seed. Just wondering how you handle that. Are you using the different compartments when you're putting a mix in? How do you do that?
It's something that we considered, but we've been doing it enough, and we buy some cover crop seed pre-mixed, and then we grow our own oats and peas and cereal rye. So what I've been doing is I've actually been mixing on the farm. We've got a couple seed totes that we kind of dump the cover crops into, and then we actually dump it into our grain buggy, and then we auger it back out into a seed tender or fertilizer tender, whichever you look at it, and then dump it into the grain drill. And for some reason, it doesn't actually settle out. We're kind of shocked that it doesn't, but yeah, even with all the little clovers and the big oats and rye and sunflowers, it doesn't seem to settle too much. So
it worked. So it's not just in one part of the field. Okay, that's good. Good.
Yeah.
Mark, another one came about the horse manure. Horse manure often has very high carbon content due to the bedding. So I'm not sure what bedding source your sister's horses have, but what rate are you applying the manure, and do you have any nitrogen tie-up when you're applying the horse manure?
Yeah, so the manure we were using, it was wood shaving was the bedding. The stuff that I was spreading in that trial was probably 2 years old, so it was fairly well decomposed. I didn't notice any real nitrogen tie-up or carbon tie-up or whatever you want to call that. We put about, for clarification, we put about 30 pounds of nitrogen on with our starter and then go back in. But yeah, the manure, it was applied, I think what they figured out is between 7 and 10 tons an acre. We just had an old horizontal beater spreader that I just drove, and wasn't very scientific at that point. It was just drive at the same speed and hope that you get the same rate. But yeah, I think they put the catch pans out and then measured it, and it was between 7 and 10 tons.
And having it composted probably really helped as well.
Yeah.
I was wondering, you have some great photos and great shots there, and you had the one regarding 20 and 40-inch row corn. People are kind of wondering what population you had the 40. Like, was it still was it same population per acre? Did you have, what kind of adjustments did you make for your 40-inch spacing?
Yeah, so last year was our first year growing 20-inch corn. So we haven't really started pushing populations yet. So the 20-inch corn was still planting at about 33,000. And so when I shut off every third row, I actually went back into the monitor and I adjusted the rate. So I was still getting 33,000 seeds per acre. So my in-row population's higher, but my overall population is still the same.
Per acre. Good. Other questions coming in. Charlene, have you used the goats for any weed management on your farm? And if so, what weeds were you targeting and how did it go?
So the goats have been an interesting case. Yeah, you hear around that goats will eat a tin can, they'll eat anything. That is the most not true thing in the universe. They are the pickiest little princesses that I have ever seen. So they are picky about the hay that they eat. We do have pastures, and yes, we were hoping to use them to clean up the feedlot area that's not kind of tillable ground. They are wonderful. They will take out sumacs like they're candy, strip the bark right off them. They will trim all your trees up 6 feet. They will stand as high on their back hooves as they can to eat all the leaves and all the tender shoots off your trees, which is great. They do not like nettles. They do not like many thistles. Sometimes they'll pick away at them a little bit, but not often. Burdocks, they will eat at one certain stage just as they're bolting. Otherwise, they're not interested. So there's definitely some weeds they're leaving behind. In our pastures, we're actually kind of struggling with it. You look across the pasture and you think, oh, wow, there's lots of feed left there. But you go and look and all your grasses have shot up and it's just the stalks, and they have stripped all the leaves from top to bottom. It's just stalks.
That's animals for you, right? Every animal's a little picky in a different way. Interesting. Wondering if we maybe circle back onto the question that kind of Mark had himself. He had that problem in the field. And I just wondered if Mike or Francois had any suggestions for Mark as far as the weed control issues he's having with the cover crops. And there still seems to be like flea bane coming through and some thistles as well. Just wonder if you had any suggestions.
Sure, I'll go first, and then Francois can chime in. Like, I think on the thistle side, Mark has the right idea. Like the challenge with having cover crops, especially if you want to maximize biomass, is there's a tendency then to want to leave them grow as long as possible out of the fall and into the early spring, and that is in direct conflict with the ideal time to manage perennial weeds, which is typically late fall. So you kind of have to make the decision, and I'm sure that's the decision Mark's toying with, is do you just go in with a glyphosate and tank mix combination as late as fall as possible, and sacrifice and kill the cover crop and the sow thistle. The other approach could be is if Mark is dealing with a multi-species cover crop, maybe you could take the approach of a selective herbicide like a 2,4-D or Lawntrel or dicamba, and maybe you sacrifice some of the cover crops, the legume species or what the broadleaf species, but the grassy cereals will be fine. And that maybe is a compromise. The fleabane stuff I'm actually interested in because and again, I would like to hear Francois's experience on this. Like, I noticed this past year, so there's going to be a mix of fleabane types in the fall. Either they've just germinated and they're in a basal rosette, or they've bolted and maybe not set seed yet. And if they're in the bolting phase, they're pretty sensitive to frost and winter kill. So usually if they've bolted, they don't survive the winter. Whereas the basal rosettes easily survive. That's been kind of my experience. So I wonder whether if those plants that Mark observed that were bolted and overwintered, I wonder if maybe there's a little microclimate effect of the cover crops that maybe allow it to overwinter more effectively. I'm just not sure, but my experience has been the rosettes happily overwinter. It's pretty tough to kill them, but bolted plants are pretty wimpy. In terms of overwintering. So what say you, Francois?
I agree with you, Mike. That's my impression too on the fleabane side, is that once they start to bolt, it's basically the weed is switched off to a different program, and it's like, okay, we flower, and then if things don't happen, then it's the rosette will die. So that could be an issue. I mean, I remember Eric Todsy's thesis years ago on fleabane and environmental condition. It's so variable, right? Depending, and we've noticed it in Ted's trial, right, from one year to the next. Same with Peter Sycamore students when they do the fleabane trial. 1 year you get a lot of winter kill, another year you don't get it, and you get a lot of spring recruitment. So it will be variable, and you don't want to judge by just 1 year and say, okay, this is what happened this year. This is always going to happen this way. Things may change, but I agree with your approach in terms of sacrificing. If you have a 12 species cover crop, to me, I mean, I'm not sure what Mark's thinking is behind the 12 species, but to me, they are like sort of insurance policy. You put all these species, and that a few will dominate and others will suffer, but depending on the years, you may have the grasses dominating or others, and then if you go out there with an oxinic herbicide, you get rid of the sow thistle, then you're going to lose your clover, but your rye and oat will likely survive. So that'd be my take on that.
Can I, sorry to interrupt, Marty, I want to ask if I could ask Mark a question. Just kind of curious on the plant green side of things. Are there crops that you feel are more conducive to that system? If you could rank between soybeans, dry beans, or corn, which are easier to do and less easier to do. But I guess, can you also walk me through the strategy of then like termination? Is it done, like when is it done afterwards? In the case of dry beans, like I assume you're using some residual herbicides. Part of the debate is like, if you have a dense crop, like cover crop canopy, does that intercept herbicide and make it less effective in the soil? Like, I'm just kind of curious to hear more specifically about your experiences there.
Yeah. So as far as which cover crop does better for, or sorry, which crop does better in planting green, I think beans probably do slightly better than corn. But we've been planting corn green for 5 years now, 5 or 6. We've had a few issues, mostly when the cereals, either the volunteer wheat or the cereal rye gets too thick. That's the main issue that we have. And yeah, the beans, I don't know, they just seem to thrive. The nice thing that I like about planting apple beans into a green cover is it really makes, like, especially with the zucchini beans that are notorious for putting pods basically on the ground, it really makes that first node a little bit longer, and I think you get a lot less harvest loss with planting green. Plus, you get all that material going through your combine. It's easy to thrash, and it feeds a little bit easier if the beans are a bit short. But generally, we see a nice tall plant, and I don't know why they do so well, but they do. We have a neighbor, they grow conventional or Roundup Ready soybeans. They plant them green and don't seem to have any issues. And as far as chemicals go, yeah, we do put down a lot of residuals. So that's our pre-emerge. We actually spray it. We try and spray it as close to planting as possible, but post-planting. Same with the corn. We'll get in there anywhere from 1 to 3 days after planting, and that's when we spray everything. So.
Actually, a couple more questions coming in, and just kind of on the lines of Mark's comment before on trying to control the thistles and fleabane. Brett had a question regarding about the potential options. So he has an option here that he's thinking. You just wonder what the panelists think of that. And what if you harvest small grains in July, establish a warm season cover crop, terminate that in October to manage the thistles, and then get a cool season like fall rye, because rye, of course, can grow in any cool temperatures, and then triticale grows for over the winter. Any thoughts on how that program would work? So it's kind of like putting 2 cover crops in, and I can imagine people will be talking about costs and extra planting and stuff like that. But any other thoughts regarding that potential?
Yeah.
I guess
go ahead.
Go ahead,
Mark. No, Mark. I want to hear your thoughts first.
That's going to be one of 2 trials we do this fall, basically. I don't think we're going to reseed after we burn off the warm season cover crops. I think what we're likely going to do is we'll put in like an oats and peas and rye, likely, and we'll go in late with a lawn trail or a 2,4-D or something like that. That'll hopefully get the thistles, and then the oats will winter kill and the rye will survive. So that's going to be one of our options. The other one's just probably just go oats and peas and just smoke it in October and see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I like the concept, Brett. And I mean, Brett's situation is, probably taking herbicides out of the equation here, right, in an organic system. But, if you had winter barley coming off and then you planted a warm season cover crop, maybe you get some forage out of that. And then plant in, like in Francois' trials, like triticale has been a nice, interseeded cover crop into corn, but one that puts off a lot of biomass in the fall and into the spring. So, in the absence of herbicides, the game plan is really not a whole lot different for managing thistles. The fall is still the best time to do it. You try and make those plants exhaust as much energy as possible into top growth, and then cutting it off so that they're, weakening their roots so they have less ability to overwinter. Of course, it sounds easy in theory. It's difficult to do in practice, but you're certainly, no one can accuse you, Brett, of not trying to hammer sow thistle in that proposed scenario. Like, I think it's a good strategy.
And with these weeds like these, especially if it's a thick sow thistle or kind of thistle, you need to have a at least 3-year plan, in my experience. People, because with herbicides, we've been able to get sometimes a one-shot approach, and then we get 99% control, and then we're going for the ride. But if you have limited use of herbicide or timing doesn't work, you try to knock them down, as Mike says. But you need to be on the lookout the other years and have a plan in case it's been spotty or they come back, and what you're going to do. So I used to get these questions for nutsedge, what do you do? And then they would come with a 5-year plan to looking at the rotation, try to get barley in the system and highly competitive crops, which is not always appealing. If someone wants to be in a corn soybean rotation with maximizing trips to the field, then that gets more tricky. So we have this approach. If I may ask a question, Marty, I've sort of raised my hand there. That's not a mistake. That's just a question, because you got people with experience there. Mike showed oats, and he mentioned the interseeding trial we did last summer, and we're repeating this year. Last year we had rye, triticale, and oats interseeded in corn, and to me the oats was a disaster. It started good, but then the rust got in there, and then they almost disappeared. We're supposed to look at herbicide response, but basically there was no response to look at. But you showed very thick oats cover crop out there without corn. So I'm just thinking, is the disease issue in oats, is it something that others have seen, and is it because the interseeding has been stressing the oats too much that they got hammered by the rust?
Well, I mean, oats get rust pretty easily, and some varieties are more susceptible than others. Like those oat cover crops after winter cereals are harvested, like they will have rust in it, and the severity will depend, and that's why some, especially if they're harvesting for grain feed, may use a foliar fungicide. I don't know, Mark, what's been your experience with an oat cover crop? Like I always get some rust in it if I see it. So.
Oats and rust. I don't know if I've ever noticed rust in ours. But we're also in central or eastern Ontario, so our growing seasons may be a bit shorter than some of the guys in Western Ontario. So it might, by the time the oats are big enough to really show signs of or get infected by rust, maybe it's too late in the season for us. I don't know, that's just, yes, there's something that I've never noticed on our farm anyways.
As we're talking about the cover crops, I'm kind of wondering, does anybody feed their cover crops? Just wondering, Charlene or Mark, are you using any fertility programs to help your cover crops? And just thinking about the oats and rust and stress and everything else, sometimes if lack of moisture, lack of nutrients kind of does it as well.
So I'm hoping to do a little more work trying some different cover crops for forage next year, but I haven't really got that experience at this moment in time.
I think the way I took that question was if I'm fertilizing my cover crops. So last year I banded fertilizer when I seeded the cover crops. That's more for the following crop than for the covers, but obviously they will use some of that. And usually before when we used to broadcast them, we broadcast them with potash or whatever we're putting on. Again, more for the following crop than the cover crops, but yes, they will use them. What I see from that is, yeah, you get a little bit more growth out of the cover crops, which actually might be beneficial with more biomass plus more compaction, alleviation, and also maybe your roots will go deeper and maybe they'll draw more nutrients from your subsoil. So I kind of look at it as just kind of cycling the nutrients. If they take a bit of what I'm putting down, that's fine, because we've got pretty good organic matter. So the decomposition is always going to release some nutrients. So that's how I look at it anyways.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Another question that kind of came up was about, this is probably for Francois, What are the chemical compounds that rye uses in the field setting? So I imagine that's the allelopathic effect. And what is that chemical that's creating that allelopathic effect?
There's more than one. There's a range, and most grasses will produce these compounds, or similar compounds. Corn will do it, wheat will do it. It's just that rye and triticale tend to produce more, and the BX stands for benzoes oxyalone. It's a complicated chemical name, so BX goes easier. So you get things like BOA, di-BOA, and then glucoside. So there's a whole range of these compounds, and then in isolation, they've been shown to reduce germination or emergence of some different species. The question becomes, under field conditions, we know they're not that persistent. So it'd be like almost a herbicide that's released by the rye that gets in the soil, but that doesn't survive very long, right? So if you put metribuzin or Sancor, if you put Prowl, you get some residual. With those compounds, they very quickly degraded by soil bacteria, so the effect can be quite transient. So that explains also why some people might say, I put rye out there, I got fantastic weed control, and somebody else might say, I didn't get much, right? And then maybe it's a question of timing. By the time these compounds were released and weed germination occurred, you get out of sync. So that's been the theme, looking at the studies that looked at rye allelopathy and weed control. It's very, very variable, and then people have been trying to find out what's the sweet spot, and then you look at studies, let's say from Arkansas and North Carolina, and they seem to find a sweet spot, but then you think, okay, is it applicable to what we have here in Ontario? Or if you move to people from Manitoba ask me, say, well, the winter there is way different, so not an easy one.
And a great visual of that too is the picture that Mark had, and the picture with Ryan without Ryan. You see his corn was a leaf behind, a lighter color, and that's really that allelopathic from the rye. I was just wondering, Mike or Francois, is that been studied, and they know that so many days after the rye is starting to decompose, you need to keep your corn crop kind of away from the rye, and a lot of people want to plant green. But what are your recommendations?
Well, we got a study, that's happening right now that's being funded in part by OMAFRA and GFO. Thank you very much. When we were looking at terminating rye 2 weeks before, 1 week before, a day before, and then planting green, terminating 1 week after. And we've noticed in the late termination, planting green, we've observed last year, it's only 1 year, but we saw that one leaf behind thing. And under the extreme conditions, we have other factors when, it's, very high rye density and, planting green, there was a little bit of yield penalty, about 12%, if I remember. So, it was there. When we skipped rows, we let some more space in the rye, then there was less penalty. It seemed to me that, at least from 1 year of data, and I'm careful because we're repeating this year and next year, we're going to have like 5 site years, but from the first year of data, like terminating or planting and terminating about the same time, 1 day before, 1 day after, gave you a good compromise in terms of biomass accumulation. And then by the time the corn emerged, any effect from the rye was gone. I'm saying that with, being careful, because last year's rye is way different than this year rye. The rye was planted in October 20 at Leare, better conditions, and in the spring, at least to me, it seemed like much thicker and taller. So we planted the corn in a very different cover crop than the year before. So that's why we need these, multi-site, multi-year studies before we can sort of draw some good conclusions.
That kind of leads to one of the other questions, Francois, that came up, was about the density of the seeding rate for weed suppression. So you're talking about biomass and how much is accumulating the effect on corn, but also for weed suppression. Do you need amount of biomass, or is there a recommended population pounds per acre that farmers could use?
Yeah, I had a number here, but it's in kilograms per hectare. I was trying to do the conversion, but I remember talking to Mike about those, right? Aren't we talking about 50 pounds per acre being a base, and then some organic growers going with with more rye biomass? I tried to remember what we discussed, a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, as you've mentioned, it's highly variable. But if you look at the environments that some of the work that we've done in Ontario has been done on, like coarser texture soils, a 50 pound per acre rate of sterile rye is providing a very good impact. Maybe that's a function of it's a more stressful environment where all those things that promote allelopathy occur. So moisture stress, nitrogen stress. So maybe you just don't need as much rye to accomplish it. And maybe if you're on a loam soil where it's not as stressful, the rate needs to be higher. But I until you kind of get your comfort level for your own operation, I'm kind of a simple person in terms of 50 pounds per acre is not intimidating. It adds value, and then you can scale up or scale down from that point based on soil type and your own comfort level. And I think that's usually the best starting point.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in there too. I think it also depends on planting date. Like if you're planting after wheat, we probably started around the 50 pounds an acre, and because we're planting green, we've dropped it down. Like we're trying to target like 10 to 15 pounds of rye, 10 to 15 pounds of oats in our cover crop mix. But that's also planted in August. Like if you start planting in September, October, you're going to start wanting to up your rates, just because it's not going to have that same fall season to get established.
Yeah, it goes back to the
that's a
biomass.
great point. Like I've been as low as 35 pounds per acre of oats because it's going in August, right? And you have a bit more time, just to your point, to get some biomass accumulation. So that's a great point.
Yeah, in our trials we planted in mid-October, so that's I guess one of the reasons went with that seeding rate.
Yeah, it was more than just seeding rates, also the biomass and timing. Excellent comments. Brandon has a question. I'll call on Brandon. He has his hand up there if he wants to make a comment.
You already answered my question, actually, so thank you.
Oh, okay, good, thanks. Well, is there any other questions or comments? We're just about 8 after, so I know it's maybe a little bit longer, but greatly appreciate everybody's contributions today, and for those listening and participating in the questions. But I really want to thank our panelists for the great effort in their presentations and time they spent with us today and answering a lot of questions, and really help all of us kind of understand how the cover crops work and actually help us understand how we can control weeds with cover crops, which is great. So Charlene, Mark, thank you very much for your in-field experiences that you've shared with us, and Francois and Mike, thank you for your technical expertise that you're working with cover crops and weed control. Greatly appreciated. And also want to thank Cribbit Seeds for sponsoring this event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.